We are not New York City. This phrase gets repeated time and time again whenever it's related to policy changes like gun control, removing parking requirements, and of course zoning. NIMBYs love to use New York City because it's the largest city in the States with the highest density among the big cities. It also has very visible density with a tower-lined skyline. Of course, no one would say we are not Gothenburg, New Jersey, which has over twice the population density. Partially because no one has ever heard of Gothenburg, and it kinda looks like this on the ground. Huh, where are all the skyscrapers? You would think that cities all around the United States are upzoning for 69-story towers given the rhetoric, but no. It's over small things like minimum lot size or even allowing for more than 2 units on a single family lot. And this was happening in Houston, the 4th largest city in the United States, and famous for not having zoning, which is not completely true in practice. Seattle is not immune to this either. As one of the fastest growing cities in the United States, there are elected officials and people running for office who approach zoning with the mindset of, we are not New York City. Around this time, a lot of cities are working on their comprehensive plans. These plans will lay out the ways that the cities will approach transportation and zoning to accommodate population growth for the next 20 or so years. With the One Seattle Comprehensive Plan in the works, we will want to make sure that our plan can adequately accommodate the rapid growth of the city for the next 20 or so years. Back in 2009, the city had a population density of 7,076 people per square mile. In 2018, that grew to 8,444. If the same rate of growth continues to 2040, we can expect to see a population density of around 11,788 people per square mile. That population density is nowhere close to New York City, but it doesn't have to be. There are literally dozens of various cities that are in between New York City and Seattle in terms of density. Instead of focusing on the most extreme example of density in America, we should be looking at a denser city a little closer to where we are right now. Perhaps a second city for comparison.
Never too big of a price.
Chicago, baby, the Windy City. The city of Chicago has a population density of 11,943 in 2018, so maybe Seattle can learn a thing or two from Chicago. Aside from the skyline full of magnificent towers, much of Chicago's streets are lined with their iconic low-rise 2 and 3 flat buildings. These are basically duplexes and triplexes. These buildings are intimately placed by each other, making up much of Chicago's residential street fabric of low and mid-rise buildings. These missing middle-sized buildings add density at low building heights and are allowed on a sizable portion of the land in the city. Besides the middle housing, Chicago has plenty of mixed-use buildings throughout the whole city. Nearly all the lots on major arterial roads in Chicago are zoned for commercial mixed use. This means that from any residential lot in Chicago, you are no more than a 5 to 10 minute walk away from any kind of mixed-use zoning. So how does Seattle compare to Chicago for their zoning? And what is Seattle doing to prepare for growth that would lead it to rival Chicago's density?
The city, come on. And just say Shop City.
The good thing is that the Washington State Legislature passed the bill HB 1110, which legalized building various types of missing middle housing on single-family residential land. The biggest gains were for cities with over 75,000 residents, which includes allowing for 4 dwelling units on all residential land, 6 units on land within a quarter mile of major transit, and 6 units if 2 of the units are for affordable housing. This bill will open up Seattle and the state of Washington for building more missing middle housing. On the other end, mixed-use zones in Seattle are generally concentrated in urban villages, instead of striating through the city like how it is in Chicago. Going back to the One Seattle Comprehensive Plan, there were 5 presented alternatives for how Seattle would approach zoning for the future. The first 4 are trash, but here is what they are anyway. The first alternative is no action, basically keeping all the zoning the same. The second alternative is focused, which adds new concentrated areas of focused growth called neighborhood anchors. These are scaled down urban villages of multifamily and mixed uses that are going to be placed in low density neighborhoods. The third alternative is broad, which would allow for low-rise multifamily housing on all residential land and broad density increases throughout the city. A lot of this is covered by the passing of HB 1110. The fourth alternative is corridors, which would upzone corridors throughout the city to focus growth on them. And finally, the fifth alternative is combined, basically including all the upzones from alternatives 2, 3, and 4 and combining them together. Alternative 5 includes all the necessary changes to be in line with Chicago in terms of density from zoning, and it received strong support from public comments overwhelmingly backing it. In fact, people were commenting with the desire for an alternative 6 to include for even more density than alternative 5 had to offer, with a bigger focus on equity, public transit, and complete neighborhoods. If we do end up going with an alternative 5 or 6 as our comprehensive plan, will Seattle look like Chicago overnight? Fuck nah! Even cities with similar densities will look different based on historical development patterns and how their city will approach infill development in the present and future. Chicago historically urbanized in a denser form, so much more of the city is going to look consistently dense compared to Seattle. Even with the most radical alternative, the densest developments will still only be in currently existing high-density areas. You are not going to see a skyscraper ever show up in a place like Wedgwood. What happens when we zone for too little? Well, you might end up in a situation like Vancouver, BC. Dense tower developments in a few concentrated areas surrounded by low density. The city is rewarded with rock-bottom vacancy rates and sky-high housing prices. Not zoning enough also leads to some neighborhoods losing population too. Predominantly single-family home zones in Seattle ended up losing population since the 70s, despite the city's current population boom. Can you zone for too much then? At the end of the day, development doesn't happen overnight, and not everyone is going to develop their land to the maximum allowed zoning. Many homeowners will still choose to hold on to their house or building. Because of this, it makes sense to err on the side of being ambitious rather than conservative, because all zoning is just a limit on what you can do. It's not a mandate or a guarantee of density. Hell, sometimes developers go in the opposite direction. This lot is zoned for NC3P, which is a pedestrian-focused commercial zone that limits pedestrian-facing parking. This building in the University District was demolished to build a parking lot? Yeah, something seems off here. And this place is literally 2 minutes away from the light rail station. This isn't an isolated incident either. More or less the same thing happened here in South Lake Union. Outside of just being able to house more people, we also want more people to be able to access the amenities and neighborhoods that are only accessible for those who can afford a single family house. Zoning has an effect on people's health too when we cluster the densest housing right next to loud and polluted highways. By not changing zoning, we are forcing a growing number of our residents to live closer to pollution. With that being said, NIMBY comments are commonly given out in public meetings in bad faith to reinforce the status quo at the expense of others by invoking extreme and unrealistic fever dream scenarios they made up in a desperate attempt to convince people that the world will end in gridlock traffic and skyscrapers if you let someone live in a duplex next door. Instead of falling for NIMBY exaggerations, cities can be sensible and think of more realistic examples to aspire to. For Seattle, that could be Chicago, DC, or San Francisco. But for smaller metro areas, like the Research Triangle in North Carolina, that could be looking at Seattle, Portland, or Minneapolis for inspiration. it.